Good afternoon. I have to begin by complimenting you, very stout Orthodox. At 3 p.m. on Friday afternoon, the Anglicans would be drinking sherry. So, well done. Maybe you make up for that with vodka later on, I don't know. And if I might be permitted a point of ecumenical privilege, some of you know that Father Hatfield is an alumnus several times over, a repeat offender, you might say, from Nashotah House. So it is a particular privilege for us to be here, Nashotah House at St. Vladimir's. And others of you will know that Nashotah House and St. Vladimir's have a concordat with one another by which we are covenant partners as seminaries. And St. Vladimir's is daily in our prayers at Mass. And so we think of you often, and this partnership is very meaningful to us. It's also a great privilege to be among these outstanding colleagues today, and especially His Eminence on the occasion of this series of books on Jesus and the Gospels. My presentation this afternoon seems to move off the beaten path with the title Elect Strangers, the Ecclesiology of 1 Peter. And we're going to begin by asking the question if there is such a thing as a Petrine ecclesiology. Here we go. Sharing conceptual features across the corpora of the New Testament, 1 Peter, nevertheless, is a precise echo of none of them. One 19th century German New Testament scholar, H.J. Holtzmann, comments wryly that on tradition-critical grounds, the author of 1 Peter must have known the whole New Testament. I think that's kind of funny, but you do you. Tongue-in-cheek though that might be, there's something accidentally synthetic to this letter, notwithstanding the particularities of its social motivations. Now, if it seems strange to interrogate a Catholic epistle in the context of a conference celebrating Metropolitan Hilarion's multi-volume work on the life and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth, let it be allowed that this paper be understood as an exercise of reception history. That is, 1 Peter itself being an act of reception of Jesus' traditions. I will not take the time to demonstrate the extent to which 1 Peter replicates Jesus' traditions and or stands under their influence. This can be found in any number of technical commentaries in the introduction. But put differently, whatever else we might make of 1 Peter, one useful way to think of it is as the reception and appropriation of both the Christ event and the Jesus traditions as these bear authoritatively upon Gentile persons, or so I will argue, at least one generation later. Of these, the letter says, these Gentiles, that is, although you do not see him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy. That said, it is arguably a curious exercise to explore the ecclesiology of a letter that never names its audience as an ecclesia. Why a discourse this conditioned by tradition never uses that term can be a question open only to speculation. But one thinks of at least three possible and not mutually exclusive reasons. One, the author's most important ecclesial claim is not that the recipients are ecclesia, but that they are, in some sense, Israel, now newly reconfigured. Two, the author's chief rhetorical burden is to steer these communities into a life, an anastrophe, of recognizable holiness against overwhelming pressures to capitulate or to isolate. Three, in that vein, as John Eliot has argued indefatigably, the community addressed is a household itself rather than an ecclesia comprising households. Now, whether any of this explains the absence of the word ecclesia in the letter's discourse is more than we could say. And I offer these not so much as an argument from silence, but suggesting that the silence is a phenomenon that invites some reflection. Yet, as an ecclesial reflection, this letter holds its own with any document of the New Testament. Indeed, the encyclical seemingly touches on almost every conceivable dimension of what we like to call ecclesiology, save again only for the word church. Here we have a rich and varied metaphorical depiction of the people of God, a similar and paradoxical account of the relation of the Christian community to the world, a saturation of probable baptismal language, a tidy and instructive account of spiritual gifts, and even a hint, though not much more, a hint on church order. In salvation historical and eschatological concord with the broad strokes of the other New Testament writings, 1 Peter offers less of a corrective or a recipe for ecclesial renewal than it sees the church, again, never so named, as renewal, as a new covenant fulfillment of Israel's promise and bearing and imparting eschatological life to its members and through them to the world. 1 Peter bears the conviction that something new has come to pass, yet in a continuity with the old. This salvation, a manifestation of grace, was the object of the prophet's careful search and inquiry, unto whom it was revealed that they had been serving not themselves, but you, with their anticipatory announcement of the gospel. This happy denouement is to the divine drama is, after all, the kind of thing ever curious angels long to gaze into, 1:12. Likewise, 1 Peter understands that this renewed state of affairs births a church animated by eschatological life. We have been, quote, born anew to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We are, again, born anew, not of perishable seed, but imperishable, through the living and abiding Word of God. Again, we have entered into an inheritance, imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for us. Thus, here as elsewhere, the pattern of new covenant promise fulfilled and new creation life anticipated marks the identity of the people of God. Now, time does not permit, nor does this occasion, a rehearsal in a textbookish way of all of these features, which are readily accessible elsewhere, not least in Craig Keener's new commentary on 1 Peter. It occurred to me that, I would be presenting on 1 Peter. Craig Keener just came out with his new commentary. My paper does not yet reflect that. And then I thought, well, maybe I should change topics. And I thought, well, let's talk about something Craig hasn't written about. And then I thought, well, that would be a miracle. But he's written extensively on miracles. I focus here instead primarily on 1 Peter's contribution to our understanding of Christian identity. I choose this as our point of departure, first simply because I believe it's the author's point of departure, but secondly because against the backdrop of the smooth contours of our thematized ecclesiologies, it might be invigorating and even a corrective to wrestle with the more variegated picture of this primitive text. So, constructing Christian identity. If we were to ask what is the identity of the church from the vantage point of 1 Peter, the starting point would have to be the same as the author's, who addresses his readers as elect sojourners of a diaspora. Chapter 1, verse 1. Well, the force of each of these terms is subject to some dispute. It is evident upon any reading that the identity of the readers is couched in paradox. Indeed, as I will argue, constructed to be a paradox. In the very juxtaposition of the word elect and sojourner, eklektois peripedemos, happy for the Erasmian pronunciations already offered today, is found the letter's theme, eklektois peripedemos, an identity construction that indelibly frames the world of the letter's readers. I say identity construction not simply because it is en vogue to say that, but because the evidence suggests that constructing an identity is precisely and intentionally what our author is doing. This claim, however, hinges on two contestable judgments. One, that despite the proliferation of descriptive biblical and Jewish metaphor, the recipients of the letter are not ethnically Jewish, or at least not predominantly so, but rather Gentiles, or at least predominantly so. Two, that the reference to their resident alien status under various descriptors is likewise a metaphor rather than a literal description of a socio-political plight. Now, although both judgments are disputed, arguments for either a literal Jewish diaspora readership or the readers as literal refugees ultimately, I think, fail to convince. And here we scan through about 5 pages of argument that won't happen today, but we hope will be in the published volume. Now, having not said that, and wary as we might be to leverage a theological reading of a biblical text on contingent historical critical judgments, such as those two, in this case it seems almost unavoidable, and that exegesis requires such judgments, and that they may even prove felicitous toward theological ends. Indeed, it could be argued that these historical critical judgments are the basis which yield the more theological interpretation of the text. If the dense Jewish covenantal description of the recipients merely speaks of them as they are ethnically, then the author simply tells them what they already know of themselves, and we might ask, toward what effect? If, however, the readers are, as most interpreters understand, ethnically Gentile, or predominantly so, the unrelenting description of the recipients as though now covenantally Israel carries profound import. Likewise, if the author merely acknowledges the reader's social circumstances as though facts on the ground, we might credit him more for his pastoral sensitivity than for his theological perspicacity. As it is, on the supposition that these readers are neither Jews primarily nor literal exiles, we cannot conclude otherwise than our author is engaged in a most willful act of identity construction, if you will, a mythos in service of an ontos. If these judgments are correct, then these Gentiles, or this ethnically mixed readership described as elect sojourners of a diaspora, are being provocatively cast in a very specific way. And it is perhaps not an overstatement to consider 1 Peter as the New Testament ecclesiology par excellence. Moreover, not merely the themes of the letter, but the paradox of Christian identity is found in the juxtaposition of these two words, eklektois peripedemos, elect strangers. It is unfortunate in this regard that the 3 or 4 English translations of the Bible with which we are most familiar, at least in my tradition, the King James and its descendant, the New King James, the RSV, and I would say most disappointingly, the New Revised Standard, all manage to obscure the author's paradox by transposing eklektois to verse 2 and leaving it absent in verse 1. And this toward an entirely unhappy outcome. The substantival eklektois, a terminus technicus collective term for the people of God, elect, is rendered as though a passive participle, chosen, and in verse 2 and not in verse 1. And the effect is to turn an identity construction, ecclesiology if you will, into something more like a soteriological claim. chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father by the sanctification of the Spirit in the sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ, something like that. And thus, the evocative paradox of the original juxtaposition is obscured, indeed, literally lost in translation. The right and left lenses, eklektois peripedemos, through which the entire letter is meant to be read, are made then to be a kind of monergist monocle, unless you follow Dr. Keener's Arminian reading of verse 2. If, however, we agree that this is indeed the author's proposal, two observations follow, one inferential and the other confirmable. First is that these grammatically apposite terms, although they stand in the sharpest possible conceptual contrast, elect and strangers, are, however, related as though cause and effect. The privilege and security of election, the glory of which this author finds inexpressible, is actually the cause of the exilic experience, with its pains, threats, and marginality in the world, which are not merely offset by the glory of heaven, but are the present consequence of it. This is because, as another New Testament writer would put it, friendship with the world is enmity with God is not only true in itself, but also true in the obverse. Exclusive loyalty to God may well incur the contempt of the world. In any case, 1 Peter tells his readers that they should not be caught off guard if it is the case. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place among you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. You're elect, after all. Reading 1 Peter canonically, it is natural to infer that the basis for this exile or these alien metaphors is that there is a truer citizenship in a heavenly kingdom. One thinks of Philippians 3:20-21, Hebrews 11, and so on. But this reasonable inference, sometimes casually and innocently assumed by 1 Peter commentators, is not actually a feature of 1 Peter's metaphorical furniture. If we were to ask the author why or how it is that those bearing the name Christians are aliens and strangers, the answer seems rather that this is the alienating consequence of an enacted holiness. But just as he who called you is holy, be holy in all your conduct, for it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Their recently adopted abstentions are found strange by their social peers, and when they do not join in as they once had, they are vilified for it. Indeed, these ethnic Gentiles now bear the appellations of Israel so without qualification, and bear a Christian manner of life so distinctive that by Gentiles, the author now refers to the pervasive socio-religious juggernaut from which his readers have been delivered and from whom they now suffer scorn. The source of this ostracism, and worse, is their discordant alterity resulting from their enacted social holiness. So we can speak, if we wish, of some other worldly citizenship, but the author of 1 Peter does not, true though it is. Instead, the language of alien and exile is figurative language accounting for a literal experience of alienation. Although the whole of 1 Peter is shot through with this paradoxical identity, it is especially concentrated at a decisive turning point in the letter, chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, in which the author expands on the theme of election by means of a surfeit of biblical figures: chosen race, royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. And then, following in verses 11 and 12, following without transition as he describes them as those same people, aliens and strangers. Thus, what you find in 2 words in 1:1 is now expounded in 4 verses in 2:9 through 12. Thus, some thoughts about the grammar of election. Together, verses 9 through 12 are the bold, scripture-saturated conclusion to a pivotal account of election in the preceding verses. As you come to him, a living stone rejected by man, yet to God elect and precious, you yourselves also, like living stones, are built into a spiritual house. Thus it is understood that the election of Christians is derivative from and concomitant to God's election of Jesus Christ. Or to put it differently, participation in the election of Jesus Christ is the consequence of sharing in God's own estimation of his Son. Thus, becoming living stones joined to the living stone and made into a spiritual house and a holy priesthood. The grammar of this somewhat complex 2-verse sentence, chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, should not be passed by without remark. There is some question of what is intended here because the grammatical form of the main verb in verse 5, okidomeste, may be parsed either as an imperative or as an indicative, as you all know about your second-person plurals. Or you will know soon enough. Or you maybe were once told. With the Revised Standard and the New Revised Standard, the force may be an exhortation to let oneself be built, passive, into a spiritual house, which would then probably carry with it the implied mood of the introductory phrase of the preceding verse, yielding thus, come to him and let yourselves be built. Rather more probably than the translation of the RSV and New Revised, rather more probably the text should be read as an assertion, oikodomeste as an indicative, speaking not to what we must do, but declaring what is in fact wrought by God in our coming to Christ, the living stone. By this rendering, as you come to him, while you come to him, a participle again, you are being built. Right? Understood this way, we detect the faint outlines of something along the lines of a Catholic or Orthodox ecclesiology. In other words, there is no coming to Christ that is not also at the same time an incorporation into the spiritual house being built by God. As you come, you are being built. This is the work of God. The election of Jesus Christ is concomitant with the election of a people bearing his name and grafted into his vocation. Incorporation into Christ is a gift, not an accomplishment. Likewise, the church is not a voluntarist, elective epiphenomenon, but is itself constitutive of Christian identity. And here I know I preach to the choir, but every now and then the choir's got grammar on its side, so enjoy it. Following immediately in verses 2, 6 through 8, the author appeals in rapid succession to 3 disparate Old Testament stone texts. In turn, Isaiah 28:16, Psalm 118:22, also in the gospel tradition, Isaiah 8:14. Not incidentally, the 2 Isaiah texts figure prominently as a composite citation in Paul's argument concerning Jewish unbelief in Romans 9:33. And Psalm 118:22, the stone which the builders reject has become the cornerstone, is of course the text concluding the parable of the wicked tenants in the synoptic tradition. These Christological use of these texts here and elsewhere has suggested to many scholars that the primitive church gathered to itself a Christological catena of sorts, in this case stone testimonia. Although the original referent for each of these texts is subject to some debate, we should probably see Isaiah 28:16, an original reference to the remnant of Israel, Psalm 118, an opaque, somewhat messianic figure, while Isaiah 8:14 is clearly a reference to the Lord God of Israel, the tetragrammaton of the Hebrew text. Theologically, the collocation of these texts in this dense argument is early Christian testimony to the complex identity of Jesus construed at once, and I might add already, as Israel Redivivus, as God's Messiah, and indeed as the covenant God of Israel, all in the span of 3 verses. As such, the same cornerstone upon which persons are built into a holy temple is also the scandalon over which they stumble. The elect one is himself the crisis effecting the consequent election of a people. It is no surprise, then, when in verses 9 and 10, that people living and united to the living stone are named by another proliferation of Old Testament covenantal descriptors, primarily drawn from Exodus 19, 5 and 6, and Isaiah 43, 20 and 21, actually in an A-B-B-A pattern. Isaiah 43, 20, an elect race, a royal priesthood, Exodus 19:6, a holy nation, Exodus 19:6, back to Isaiah, a possessed people, a people of God's own possession, Isaiah 43:21. Of course, dutifully, something could be said more about each of these descriptors. Time does not allow. But these designations gather especially then from the Exodus Sinai constitution of Israel and the exilic reconstitution of Israel, showing once again the sheer willfulness of the predication of this identity upon Gentiles scattered in northern Asia Minor. These who were recently aliens and strangers to the commonwealth of Israel are now aliens and strangers by election, but aliens and strangers to the world. Election and vocation. Equally significant for our ecclesial reflection is the ascription of purpose that follows immediately in verse 10. In order that, hapos, you might proclaim the virtues of the one who called you out of darkness into his light. Our standard translations take this all-important clause in a variety of exegetically defensible ways, yet with shades of difference. Here the Greek word arete, aretas, plural, is rendered as praises, sometimes mighty deeds. We know the word as virtues. And those minor variations aside, it seems that the primary sense of the clause is that election, the constitution of God's people in 2:9, breeds a vocational end for the people of God that is irreducibly evangelical. The purpose of this extraordinary election of Gentiles, this unforeseen renewal of the people of God, is that they might testify, exangelo, tell out, the enacted virtues and mercies of a redeeming God. Evangelical. This evangelistic vocation is borne out in what immediately follows, as the text turns in verses 11 and 12, as if on a hinge, from the election wrought in Christ to the consequent vocation of that people in the world. Thus again, verses 9 and 10 juxtaposed to verses 11 and 12 are juxtaposed as election to exile in an expansive reprise of the first verse of the letter. I urge you as aliens and strangers. I urge you as aliens and strangers. I'm trying to skip ahead here in interest of time. Well, notice this. Then the exalted and exclusive relationship to God, just rehearsed in verses 9 and 10, turns immediately to their position in the world, aliens and strangers. Yet, as such, precisely as such, the marginalized and maligned are dignified with evangelical charter. There is no hint of grandiosity here, no triumphalistic plan to reach the world for Jesus Christ in our generation, no such sloganeering, but the author is hardly content to counsel mere survival to his beleaguered people. It is assumed that the holy elect people of God, aliens and strangers though they are nonetheless a people on mission. albeit a mission largely portrayed in terms of a quiet, resilient holiness. On the one hand, they are to resist fleshly lusts that are at war against their souls, and on the other, they are to resolve to lead a recognizably virtuous public life. And the author posits two outcomes. This tactic will silence the slander of contemptuous onlookers, a contempt which the author regards as inevitable but not insurmountable, so that when they malign you as evildoers, they may instead behold your good works. And again, a few verses later, it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Secondly, he holds the more ambitious hope that the manner of life these Gentiles among Gentiles will be such that observing their honorable deeds, these who once scoffed will instead glorify God on the day of visitation. And although there might be some variety of ways that these spectators could glorify God on the day of his visitation, the most contextually compelling is that, having observed and been silenced by the good deeds, they are converted by means of the same, such that the great and terrible day of the Lord is transformed into a day of rejoicing. Ecclesial implications in conclusion. As depicted by 1 Peter, the missional life of the aliens and strangers will bear three marks. It is incarnate and non-isolationist. This is a brave life conducted among the Gentiles. Secondly, it is socially apologetic. It extinguishes the slander of hostile bystanders. And thirdly, it is subversively evangelistic, whereby God is eventually glorified by his erstwhile enemies. Thus, those holding on for dear life under first century persecutions are counseled rather to hold out a precious life for the sake of those who abuse them. This is the clear pattern of the ensuing and thematically illustrative instructions, in turn to citizens, 13 through 17, to slaves, 18 through 25, to wives, 3, 1 through 6, concluding with an exhortation to the whole community to live with holy resolve, peaceably among hostile forces, under the watchful eye of the requiting Lord. Rightly understood, these exhortations to aliens and strangers are not a passive acquiescence to injustice, but the trusting resolve of responsible agents under the eye of a watchful and just God. These instructions tell us that there is no life station or circumstance in which the saints of God cannot carry out their mission, provided they are the holy people of God, at once markedly distinguished from their neighbors, while also being neighbors to their neighbors. Or as the Epistle of Diognetus would put it later, these are persons distinguished not by country, nor language, nor customs, but by their confessedly striking manner of life. And this, I propose, is the renewal wrought first in the church and then by the church, whereby her members grace even the fallen structures of oppressive regimes with the new creation life of the age to come, already in Jesus Christ, crucified and resurrected. Thank you.
Being an absent-minded professor, when I was packing, I forgot my tie. And also, I noticed during the last presentation that Professor Anderson, when he mentioned my Arminian reading of 1 Peter 1, 1 and 2, I forgot what I said. But anyway, but exploring potential signs of historical memory in Mark's miracle accounts, I'm grateful to be invited to participate in this conference and to celebrate Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev's work on Jesus and the Gospels. Because the previous conference, to which the Metropolitan invited gospel scholars in Moscow, focused on Matthew's gospel, and because the Metropolitan has contributed extensively to the discussion of Jesus' miracles, I thought it particularly appropriate to contribute an essay regarding miracles in Mark's gospel. I have argued at length elsewhere that the general default expectation for reported events in full-length biographies from the early empire, when composed about figures from within living memory, should be that they normally reflect a memory of genuine events, except where we have good reason to suggest otherwise. What I offer here, then, are merely some subsidiary considerations regarding particular pericopes where the limitations of surviving evidence requires careful attention to the details that remain. Some have argued for pre-Markan miracle catenae. More recently, Richard Bauckham has provided evidence for authentic memory in the healing of Simon's mother-in-law, Jairus' daughter, and Bartimaeus. Trying to avoid rehashing too much older ground here, I will thus focus on other accounts in the first half of Mark's Gospel. By themselves, none of the following suggestions are conclusive. Much of the proposed evidence works well in a traditional Roman provenance of the Gospel, which I support, but only a portion of it works if, with many scholars today, one adopts a Syrian provenance for Mark. I've omitted some examples and much discussion from the written paper for the sake of staying within my time frame and for the sake of not having to hyperdose in caffeine to talk at triple speed. If I have time left over at the end, I will throw in a bonus passage, although it's more debatable than some of the others. First, dealing with a priori dismissal of historical memory in miracle reports. As just noted, there is good, purely historical reason to trust the average early imperial period accounts from within living memory. They normally reflect genuine events, except where we have good reason to suggest otherwise. Some scholars contend, however, that in the case of the Gospel's healing and exorcism accounts, they constitute good reason to suggest otherwise. Sometimes this rests on the supposition that claims of most of the sorts of experiences in the Gospels defined as miracles never stem from genuine eyewitnesses. As I have again argued at length elsewhere, however, that supposition is demonstrably problematic. Today, respected surveys indicate that hundreds of millions of people globally claim to have witnessed such experiences. Witnesses include a significant proportion of medical doctors and a large number of people whose backgrounds predispose them to reject such claims before they experience them. I personally do believe in special divine action, but however one explains such experiences, in any case, in a given case, the evidence is overwhelming and simply incontrovertible that eyewitnesses do report these sorts of experiences within living memory and often immediately after the event. Not least because miracles appear in every stratum of gospel tradition, the strong majority of historical Jesus scholars, regardless of their theological orientation, recognize that healings and exorcisms characterized Jesus' ministry. Many scholars who doubt the reality of special divine action, that is, a specifically theistic interpretation of the experiences, nevertheless grant that this was the understanding and the reported experience of Jesus' contemporaries. Mark offers particularly plentiful accounts of individual healings and exorcisms, as roughly half of Mark's narrative before the Passion consists of accounts of miracles. Besides default reasons noted above, it may be helpful to note some features fundamental to Mark's stories that make far better sense in a Galilean milieu than in the diaspora. If Mark writes for a diaspora audience, then these features point to stories predating Mark's own writing. Since the Galilean leaders of Jesus' movement settled in Jerusalem at an early period, Galatians 1:18 and 19 and 2:1 and 9, Galilean features likely stem from the memories of the first disciples rather than subsequent supplementation by others in the movement. So, several observations. I begin with some brief observations, most already individually suggested by other scholars, concerning elements in some of Mark's miracle accounts that fit Jesus' Galilean milieu far better than the milieu of Mark's putative diaspora audience. These include Jesus' invitation to stand in the midst of the synagogue in 3:3, the title of the sea, the thalassa, and the character of the storm in 4:37 to 39, the name Bethsaida in 6:45, the character of Capernaum and Galilean homes in Mark chapters 1 and 2. So very briefly on the first one, standing forth in the midst, Mark 3:3. Calling the man with the disabled hand to stand in the midst, Messon, fits Judean Galilean synagogue architecture from this period. In contrast to later synagogues, Judean and Galilean synagogues before 70 were normally arranged around the center of the room with elevated tiers of benches facing one another. Standing in the midst places the man in everyone's sight. Sudden storms on the Sea of Galilee in 4:35 to 41. This would be 6. Yeah, you got it. Aside from debates about the possibility of nature miracles, other elements of the account fit local conditions, hence likely originate with the earliest sources from Galilee. Some also object to the possibility of Jesus sleeping during a storm, but it would be possible in the shielded area under a Galilean boat's high stern, 438, though this nautical architecture was not limited to Galilean boats. Features more distinctive to Galilee might include, for example, the size of the recovered Galilee boat, which could hold 15. More important, Mark follows the local practice of describing the Lake of Galilee as a sea, thalassa, in 439 and 41. Many Greek writers use the title only for the Mediterranean. An early critic of the Gospels marks their use of thalassa for the lake, and even a Judean refers to the Lake of Galilee as Limne. Mark preserves the label he has heard from an earlier teller or tellers who used the presumably local designation thalassa. Depiction of the windstorm without mention of rain or lightning fits local conditions on the north of the lake, matters not likely often considered even in Jerusalem, much less the diaspora. Mendel Nun, a leading Israeli expert on fishing on the lake, notes how well the disciples' experience in the narrative comports with those of fishermen on the lake today. Surrounded by ravines, the lake is some 209 to 215 meters, or roughly 700 feet below sea level. If you want to walk there and have your head above water, you need to be like at least 750 feet tall, making it the world's lowest freshwater lake. Summer afternoon breezes from the west can suddenly shift the lake from a placid state to 7-foot waves. Winter storms from the east likewise stir the lake with 6 to 7-foot waves, even hurling some fish ashore. Western storms descend from the Golan Heights without warning, as here, though they stop abruptly as well. Nun notes that this is the sort of storm most feared by Galilean fishermen. The harbors associated with the lake make sense. Capernaum's harbor stretched for more than 2,500 feet, close to 800 meters, and included piers projecting into the lake 100 feet long. Just about 2 miles south of Capernaum lay Tabga, ideal for winter fishing because musht, a leading local fish, swarmed to its 7 warm springs during winter. Jesus' fairly ready access to boats makes sense if he had disciples who were Galilean fishermen, which in turn is unlikely to have been invented and fits what we know about Capernaum, but about which most Jerusalemites would neither know nor care. The not yet in John 6:17 also seems to presuppose that John's audience already knew the story, whether in its Markan or in oral form. Bethsaida in Mark 6:45 and 8:22. Mark's sites include villages and towns barely known outside Galilee, yet attested in Galilee familiar sources and archaeology. Some other such names are also preserved in other gospel traditions, such as Chorazin or Cana, or, by association with Mary Magdalene, Magdala. Like other toponyms in Mark, Bethsaida in Mark 6:45 and 8:22 speaks of a real location of only minor interest in Jerusalem and almost none in the diaspora. Based on Josephus and the Tetrarch Philip's coins, most argue that in 30 CE, he promoted Bethsaida to a Greek polis and renamed it Julius. Josephus calls it Bethsaida only with regard to its previous village status, otherwise always calling it by the name it held in his own day, Julius. By contrast, the Gospels consistently employ the title suiting the earliest memories of Jesus, before the disciples settled in Jerusalem in the year 30, or thereabouts. Mark, who often uses polis or city language in a wide sense, also calls Bethsaida a village in 8:23. Exorcism in Capernaum's synagogue, Mark 1:21-28. The setting of the final examples include a home in Capernaum, and especially the synagogue there, which may be safely accepted as genuine settings for some of Jesus' ministry. Capernaum was a real town. I keep making sure that's up there so they won't have to look at my bald head. But Capernaum was a real town too small. Estimates range from 600 to 2,000, and little known outside Galilee to be invented as a site for Jesus' ministry. What most scholars would consider Q tradition, and I confess I believe in that, don't hate me, but what most scholars would consider Q tradition concurs with Mark in identifying Capernaum as a site of some dramatic miracles of Jesus, Matthew 11:23, Luke 10:13 and 15. Despite Capernaum's size, it did have a first-century synagogue, usually today agreed to be the first-century black basalt structure beneath the later monumental one. It's 79 by 59 feet, or 24 by 18 meters. It is a half larger than Gamla's synagogue and more than double the size of those at Herodium and Masada. Most historical Jesus scholars today affirm that Jesus gained a reputation as an exorcist, but not all recognize that geographic features support their affirmation. Although anthropologists have documented what is indigenously understood as spirit possession in a majority of the world's cultures, in the first century Roman Empire, exorcism was associated especially with the parts of the empire east of Achaia. Extant sources attest it far more strongly by the early first century in Greater Judea than anywhere else in the empire. Galilean architecture in Mark chapter 2, verses 2-4. Judean and Galilean features in the narrative, such as the local form of roof versus many typical northern Mediterranean ones, as in Luke 5:19, suggest authentic memories. Mark's likely target audience, and probably Mark himself, had never visited Galilee, but archaeology helps us envision the sort of homes behind his story. Where would the crowd outside the door in 133 and 22 be located? Streets were public property, but narrow streets were typical for Galilean villages, including Capernaum. The street could not contain a large crowd around the door. By contrast, courtyards appear pervasively in excavated Galilean and Judean domestic structures. Often the entrance to the house was in the side courtyard, as likely with the door in Mark 2:2. This is also true for the oldest tradition for the site of Peter's house in Capernaum. As likely in the present incident, Galileans often could access stairways to homes' roofs from the courtyard. Outdoor staircases leading to roofs or upper stories are common, also mentioned in Mark 13:15, including in Capernaum homes. This is again true for the specific home attributed to Peter. Literally, the expression in 2:4 means that they unroofed the roof, possibly a Semitism consistent with the account's earlier narration by a native speaker of Aramaic. Although people in some regions could use stone slab roofs, none appear in excavations from Capernaum. Most Galileans in the Herodian period, including in Capernaum, overlaid wooden roof beams with reed mats and branches, and finally a few inches of caked mud on top as plaster. Removing enough overlying plaster and reed branches without the need to touch the beams would have been, as Morna Hooker notes, a fairly simple matter. The majority of scholars are probably correct that Luke contextualizes the image for an urban northern Mediterranean audience more accustomed to tile roofs in Luke 5:19, which could also be torn off. These were not, however, common on private dwellings in Judea and Galilee, strongly suggesting that Mark preserves the earlier Galilean imagery here. Some scholars focus more on features of the narrative that they regard as implausible. One of these features that some find difficult to imagine historically is that hostile scribes are present among the small group in the house, while crowds of sincere inquirers stand outside. By virtue of their honor in the society, however, scribes would be expected to make their way to the front for the best seats, as Mark knows in 1239. Despite Mark's consistency with Galilean architecture, some object even to the architectural aspects of the scene, given the time that digging would take, along with, in its later stages, the debris it would rain down on those below. But while Mark is more interested in the miracle and in Christology than in describing and perhaps himself visualizing aspects of the scene that would make it easier for hearers to envision, that does not mean that the story he inherits is implausible. I sampled some informants from rural Africa, including my wife, and they actually had no problem envisioning the story realistically, although tin roofs are now more common in many areas. One mitigating factor would be the presumed effort of those on the roof to minimize debris below. Those on the roof exoruxantes, to use the Erasmian pronunciation, although my printer didn't print all my Greek letters. That is, they dig out the roofing material. As Bedag observes, this should involve putting the debris to one side so that it does not fall on the heads of those in the house. The clay would be scraped off before diggers reached the bed of reeds. Granted, toward the end of the process, some dirt would inevitably fall in any case, inconveniently pouring some dust and dirt on the heads of those immediately below, though considerably less than often undertaken voluntarily in the case of mourning. Another mitigating factor is that Jesus remains in command of the situation below. If he continues teaching, no doubt loudly, see other references in Mark, without regarding the interruption as harmful, the crowd, except perhaps for those immediately beneath the demolition, will likely assume that nothing is wrong. As for concern about the roof, extended family and neighbors often helped construct roofs to begin with. So neighbors in this case might damage it with the expectation that they would aid in its subsequent repair. Repairing the roof would not be difficult, although the patching would likely be temporary until the next annual renovation. Unlike more expensive tile roofs, cheaper flat roofs required more regular attention. Residents often left a stone roller on the roof, periodically needed for smoothing exposed areas. The annual onset of rainy season required caulking potential leakage points and a new layer of mud plaster. Repairing even fallen roofs was sufficiently common to warrant later Sabbath legislation. In the final analysis, the architecture proposed in the scene is plausible and fits a Galilean milieu rather than stories that would originate in a later northern Mediterranean one, such as in Asia Minor, Achaia, or Rome. In each of the miracle narratives just noted, we note elements that might predate Mark. I surveyed some elements in Mark 3, 1-6, 4, 35-41, 6, 45-52, 121-28, and at somewhat greater length, 2, 1-12. Some seem to reflect an early Galilean provenance, specifically Galilean elements, not least memories of Capernaum and its synagogue, of fishing and the like, presumably go back to the earliest memories of Jesus and are thus consistent with normal expectations for accounts in early imperial period biographies stemming from within living memory of their subjects. Now, I said there was a bonus if I had time. I think I have 4 minutes. Yeah, so I will start the bonus, but I may not finish the bonus. We'll see. Many scholars find pre-Markan tradition in 521 to 43. Scholars cite signs of prior oral tradition and Semitic and Galilean elements to show that Jesus did not invent the accounts. Historically, that Mark did not invent the accounts. Historically, Jesus probably was pressed closely by followers in Galilean towns, as in 524. Capernaum's excavations show very limited space in front of homes, including those on the lake shore. Here I focus on community standards. Concerns about genital blood impurities were widespread in antiquity, but in most ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures, they were actually prohibited only regarding sacred space. That the bleeding woman seems to experience public shame in connection with touching Jesus' garment presupposes a setting in which her contact with Jesus violates community standards, that is, in a setting in which the wider Levitical understanding of menstrual impurity prevailed throughout the community. Verisimilitude is not the same as authentic historical tradition, but neither would we expect a diaspora setting to simply take for granted a setting in which a menstruant's touch warranted shame. Although Mark is not explicit about impurity here, a majority of scholars recognize that in Jesus' own historical context, everyone would have understood that physical contact with the zab, or in 541 with the corpse, communicated impurity. Anything or anyone she touched would become impure, according to Leviticus 15:26, as was the case also for males with fluid emissions and menstruants in 1520. Indeed, according to tradition later reported in the Mishnah, one who touched her would himself or herself convey impurity. Josephus shows us that during menstruation, women could not enter the women's court of the temple, and they even faced some restrictions regarding Passover. Granted, it was impossible for ordinary people to avoid all potential sources of impurity, but just as with exposure to cold viruses today, there was no reason not to avoid them when possible. Most commentators believe, probably rightly, that the reason the woman acted secretly was because she was violating teachings about purity. Even if we exclude the great likelihood that she would have had physical contact with others in the crowd, touching Jesus will cause him to be regarded as ritually impure himself until evening by those around. Nor would even her healing alter that perception. Even after a discharge dries up, she would be considered ritually pure again only after 7 more days, Leviticus 15:18. Jesus communicates purity without contracting impurity, but the woman and the crowd within the narrative could not presuppose this. One later rabbinic comment on purity may illustrate the concern, quoting, "If a woman pressed against a man's garments or sat with him in a boat, and the man were not clearly a priest, whom she would not come near, he must find out if she has rendered him impure." So I think this also suggests that this narrative goes back to early tradition, and my time is up, so thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Dean Gregory Sterling, has been a dean for 20 years. I learned during our lunch session together at Yale, Divinity School. He's going to be addressing the topic is the historical Jesus before or after the Gospels, continuity in the early Christian tradition. Greg.
Thank you very much, Father Chad. Well, I'm looking out at the audience, and in the biblical tradition, you are called the faithful remnant. It is Friday afternoon, and it's been a long, very rich day, but a long day. As the last speaker, I realize part of my job is to keep you awake, if I can. But I also hope that all of you will join me in expressing our appreciation to Father Chad and his team for all of the work that they have done to make this conference possible. I'm sure others will thank people, but Father Chad's going to probably be thanking everybody else, so I wanted to make sure we thanked you. I also would like to say a very special word of appreciation about Metropolitan Hilarion and what he has been doing to promote dialogue between the Russian Orthodox Church and Western scholarship. This is an act of real courage on his part. It is an act of magnanimity on his part, and it's not always reciprocated by everybody on this side of the aisle, or this side of the pond, maybe I should say. But I want to go on record as expressing my appreciation to him for his efforts in sponsoring things in Russia, for what he's done here, and for his commitment to this project. I think it's of vital importance. I also think I should probably say something about how I understand Western scholarship. The best way I can express it is by telling you a story that has a Zoroastrian framework. When God was creating the world, God created light, and Satan countered by creating darkness. God created dry land. Satan countered by creating water. And they went back and forth, dueling with one another, until way down the line, God created a scholar. And Satan was utterly dumbfounded. Satan had no idea how to respond. And after a good deal of thought, the light came on, and Satan said, I know what I'll do. I'll create another scholar. So we are independently minded, and a sign of respect is when you take someone's work seriously. So I offer my thoughts today in utter seriousness, having read the first 3 volumes. I haven't yet actually held volume 4, and I hope it will be understood within that context and within the same spirit of generosity as the Metropolitan has extended to all of us. There are 3 figures who lived in the ancient Greco-Roman world, whom everyone in the Western world knows through the accounts of their followers: Socrates, Alexander the Great, and Jesus of Nazareth. In the case of Socrates, we have the dialogues of Plato, the works of Xenophon, who also studied with Socrates, the plays of the contemporary playwright Aristophanes, and the material in Aristotle, who was Plato's student. Plato was not alone in depicting Socrates in his dialogues. There were enough other associates of Socrates, now their works are mainly, if not entirely, lost, that Aristotle could refer to Socratic dialogues in his Poetics. There are significant differences between the buffoon of Aristophanes' comedies and the serious philosopher of Plato and Xenophon. Yet even the latter 2 differ appreciably, a situation that has led to the Socratic problem, the question of whether we can construct or reconstruct, depending, I guess, on whether you're modern or postmodern, the historical Socrates, or must remain content with Plato's Socrates or Xenophon's Socrates. But even if we focus on a single source, it is challenging to disentangle Socrates from the views of his students. One only has to think of when you read in Plato, Socrates talking about the ideas. I'm pretty sure that's not Socrates, that's Plato. But how do you distinguish these things? The case is similarly complicated, although different, for Alexander the Great. In the case of the Macedonian, we have some epigraphic evidence, a hoard of numismatic evidence. You can still buy a coin of Alexander today, and a number of portraits, including the one you're looking at, which is one of the most famous. The literary accounts of Alexander are, however, more complex than they were for Socrates. The records of his contemporaries are now only known through secondary citations. We are primarily dependent upon authors like Arrian, Strabo, Curtius Rufus, Diodorus, and Justin. In addition, we have a mass of accounts that we know as the Alexander Romance, which circulated widely under the name Callisthenes, or as we call him, Pseudo-Callisthenes. While we know the main outlines of Alexander's career, specific details depend heavily on source-critical analyses. As Elizabeth Bynham wrote, quote, Alexander III of Macedon, who arguably inspired more writing than any other historical figure in the ancient Greco-Roman world, also remains one of the most elusive and mysterious, obscured and distorted by the very complexity of the literary tradition that surrounds him. End of quote. It should hardly come as a surprise that the most significant of all ancient figures, Jesus of Nazareth, inspired disciples to write accounts of his life. But the evidence is not straightforward. The major witnesses, the 4 canonical Gospels, are all anonymous, although we have later traditions that associate 2 of them with apostles, one with the disciple of one of the 12, and another with the disciple of the Apostle Paul. 3 of the Gospels are similar enough that their interrelationships have generated extended discussions. The 4th is strikingly distinct, a circumstance that has warranted a long-standing debate about its relationship to the other 3 and to the historical Jesus. We also have the letters of Paul that precede the Gospels in time, but have little specific information about Jesus' life or sayings. The same is true for other New Testament texts that sometimes preserve a saying of Jesus, but are generally quite silent. The situation changes with the non-canonical Gospels of the 2nd and later centuries that expand the tradition notably, although not soberly. The state of the evidence has led to the quest for the historical Jesus in much the same way that scholars have attempted to reconstruct the historical Socrates or the historical Alexander the Great. The difficulty of the historical search for Jesus is compounded by the theological importance that Jesus carries for Christians. The challenge of capturing a historical past for modern appropriation was given a memorable expression in Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's famous metaphor of the ugly broad ditch. Metropolitan Hilarion has offered a fresh look, which stands in opposition to the basic line of scholarly inquiry about Jesus. I would like to examine his contribution by situating it first in the light of the quest for the historical Jesus. You may have to click it one more because each point will fly in separately, if you would. Then evaluating the Metropolitan's basic approach, and finally offering a possible way forward between the scholarly quest and the Metropolitan's analysis. So first, the 3 quests for the historical Jesus. It is worth noting that there have been several quests for the historical Jesus. I do not mean that the quest stopped completely at any one point in time, but that there are notable pauses in the scholarly tradition or major points of reorientation that make it helpful to speak of 3 quests. I will summarize them by offering the major methodological issues each addressed and referring only to the major works for each turn. And some of my New Testament colleagues here will probably want At least in their minds, they're going to be commenting, oh, you should have said this or that. Fair enough. This is my take on it. First quest from 1774 to 1919. There is widespread agreement that the quest for the historical Jesus began when Lessing published the Wolfenbüttel fragments of an unnamed author between 1774 and 1778. The unnamed author was Hermann Samuel Reimarus, who challenged the historicity of the gospel accounts in 2 of the 7 fragments that Lessing published. For Reimarus, Jesus was a political Messiah who was rejected by his people. Disappointed, the disciples stole his body and invented the concept of a spiritual redeemer. On Reimarus' reconstruction, the Gospels are thus a result of cognitive dissonance and reflect the Christ of the disciples' post-crucifixion experiences rather than the historical Jesus they knew in Galilee. Reimarus' work launched the 19th century quest that focused on 3 areas. The first had been raised by Reimarus and addressed the most pressing issue posed by the Enlightenment. Were there miracles or not? The matter was most famously addressed by David Friedrich Strauss's Das Leben Jesu, published in 1835 and 1836. Strauss argued against both supernaturalists, this point has already been made, but I'm going to make it, against both supernaturalists who defended the miracles and rationalists who attempted to explain the miracle stories in naturalistic ways by positing a mythical explanation. By myth, Strauss meant, quote, a narrative relating directly or indirectly to Jesus, which may be considered not as an expression of a fact, but as the product of an idea of his earliest followers, end of quote. Now, in all candor, he has a lot more to say about that, but I'll let you look at that on your own if you desire. The effort to eliminate the miraculous from the Gospels was echoed by a number of other writers. Among scholars, most notably by Ernest Renan in his beautifully written Vie de Jesus. And if you want an American example, we have an American president, Thomas Jefferson, who spent time going through the Gospels, editing out all of the miracles in the Gospels. It's known as Jefferson's Bible. The issue is not as simple as it once appeared. Today, there is widespread agreement that Jesus was a healer, since there are modern analogies. Craig just made that point. There is, however, also widespread agreement that a historical approach must treat the Gospels in the same way that ancient historians treat other texts. The second major issue was whether the Synoptic Gospels, or the fourth Gospel, should be considered more reliable as a framework for the life of Jesus. In a series of lectures given at the University of Berlin in 1832, Friedrich Schleiermacher argued for the fourth Gospel. Strauss challenged him and eventually won the argument. Although today, the issue is not cast exclusively as an either-or debate, as much as it is a both-and proposition, with the recognition that the fourth Gospel provides some historical elements that supplement the Synoptic Gospels. The recognition that the Synoptic Gospels were the primary sources pushed the issue back a step further. Which of the 3 was first? Hermann Weisse answered the question. There were predecessors to him, but he, I think, was the most influential at an early date, by arguing for the priority of Mark and the presence of a sane source shared by Matthew and Luke, a view that we call the two-source hypothesis. The hypothesis became the opinio communis in the German world with the publication of Heinrich Julius Holtzmann's Die Synoptischen Evangelion in 1863, and in the English-speaking world with the Four Gospels of B.H. Streeter in 1924. While there have been challenges to the two-source theory, it is still the dominant theory. The reason is that the theory explains the text better than any of the alternative proposals, such as the Griesbach hypothesis. And Griesbach argued Matthew wrote first, then Luke, and then Mark. Or the Farrar hypothesis, which suggests Mark wrote first, then Matthew wrote, and then Luke wrote, who used both Matthew and Mark. In other words, there's no Q. While I recognize that Q is a putative source, a hypothesis, it still remains the best explanation for the degree of verbal agreement between Matthew and Luke and the fact that the two Gospels arrange the material in different sections of their Gospels, but in the same clusters. Now let me explain this. I'm one of these people who has to see things with my own eyes. So I sat down with a Greek synopsis of the Gospels, and I looked at all of the double tradition, that is, the material common to Matthew and Luke, and I numbered them in each Gospel, that is, just in the sequence in which it appears in that Gospel. I started with Luke because I've done more work in Luke than any other Gospel. So I numbered all of them, one and following. And then I did the same thing for Matthew. And what really struck me was that while they have this material in different parts of their Gospel, they cluster the same bodies of material. Let me give you one example. The famous woes in Luke 11 and in Matthew 23. We know these texts. So in Luke, these appear as numbers 65 through 72 in my count. And in Matthew, they go 103, 102, 100, 104, 99, 105, 106, 101. So they're not in the identical sequence, but they are clustered in the same way, which suggested to me that the most likely explanation was they were drawing from a common source, especially when this runs all the way through these Gospels. It is important to realize that the attempt to explain the relationships among the Gospels is no different than the effort to determine from which of the primary historians of Alexander the Great, Arrian and Strabo, drew their sources. If we are to speak of the historical Jesus, we must use historical methods. The third major issue was whether Jesus had an eschatological orientation. Two works at the end of the first century answered this affirmatively: the work of Johannes Weiss and Albert Schweitzer. Weiss argued against the standard liberal view that the kingdom of God represented the highest moral ideal and contended that it represented an inbreaking of God into human history that Jesus at first expected during his lifetime, but then believed would occur after his death, but during the lifetime of his disciples. Schweitzer offered a different explanation. He thought that Jesus expected the end to come during the mission of his disciples, based on Matthew 10:23, when he sends them out, says the Son of Man will come back before you return. When they returned, he was forced to alter his plans, according to Schweitzer, and attempted to force God's hand by going to his death, which he hoped would usher in the final hour. In one of the most famous statements of the first quest, Schweitzer argued that while Jesus is a strange figure to us, quote, a mighty spiritual force streams forth from him and flows through our time also, end of quote. While no one accepts the views of either Weiss or Schweitzer today, the centrality of eschatology must be taken seriously. The second quest, 1949 to 1984. Schweitzer's summary of the 19th century quest served as a memorial, you might call it a tombstone, to the first quest, in which he said each individual created him, Jesus, in accordance with his own character, end of quote. The failure of reaching any consensus, combined with the onset of World War I, which brought an end to liberal theology, marked the end of the first quest. Two figures recognized the difficulty of basing the Christian faith on historical reconstructions. At the end of the 19th century, Martin Kähler could see the final result of the quest clearly. Quote, "I regard the entire life of Jesus movement as a blind alley," end of quote. This did not mean that he rejected historical criticism, but that he thought that faith could not be based on history. He argued that the Gospels were not intended to provide a historical biography. Kähler's views did not persuade those involved in the quest. However, it found an important echo in the most influential New Testament scholar in the first half of the 20th century. In his History of the Synoptic Tradition, one of the three works that launched form criticism in New Testament studies, Rudolf Bultmann recognized that the Christ of Christian proclamation was not identical with the historical Jesus. In a subsequent essay, he rejected history as a basis for faith and argued that a biography of Jesus was not only impossible, but theologically misdirected. This did not mean that Bultmann lost all interest in Jesus. He was keenly interested in the message of Jesus and wrote a powerful theological work entitled Jesus and the Word, in English translation, just Jesus in German. He presented his work as a continuous dialogue with history that required readers to consider the demand that history places upon us. However, he recognized that, quote, "we can know almost nothing concerning the life and personality of Jesus," end of quote, and that the attempt, quote, "to penetrate behind the teaching to the psychology or to the personality of Jesus inevitably misses what Jesus purposed," end of quote. What then is the relationship between the historical Jesus and the message of the Gospels? In one of his most famous statements, he wrote, "He who formerly had been the bearer of the message was drawn into it and became its essential content. The proclaimer became the proclaimed," end of quote. With this sentence, the quest effectively disappeared, with some notable exceptions like Joachim Jeremias. It did not, however, remain closed. At a gathering of Bultmann's former students in Jugendheim, Ernst Käsemann, one of his most prominent students, reopened the quest in a lecture delivered on October 20th, 1953. Käsemann argued, quote, "We are all, without exception, concerned with the question of a proper understanding of history and historicity, which is bound to find concrete, necessary, and indeed archetypal expression for the theologian in the problem of the historical Jesus and of his significance for faith," end of quote. This was not a naive plea to return to the 19th century quest, but a sober recognition that the Gospels, the Synoptics in particular, were interested in the historical Jesus. Käsemann insisted, quote, "However strongly their conception of history, of the history of Jesus may differ, however much the real life history of Jesus may be buried under their own proclamation, it is interest in this history which we have to thank both for their genesis and for their form, which stands out in such peculiar relief against both the rest of the New Testament and the other literature of the time." End of quote. Casemon's appeal to the Gospels found a resounding response. Another student of Bultmann, Gunther Bornkamm, took up his colleague's challenge and wrote a work on Jesus in which he broke with his Doktorvater by devoting 2 chapters to Jesus' life rather than devoting the entire work to Jesus' message. Like Casemon, Bornkamm knew the historical difficulties, but thought that the Gospels not only invite, but, quote, demand this effort, end of quote. At the same time, he did not entirely break with his teacher. The focus was still on the sayings of Jesus, a focus that remained throughout the entire second quest. The most famous American participant in this quest, this is James M. Robinson, said in a lecture in Berkeley, California, and now I am quoting from my memory, and I'm not going to claim it's verbatim, but it's pretty close to what he said, "I would rather have one authentic saying of Jesus than 100 authentic deeds." The verba were far more important to these scholars than the facta. The focus on the authenticity of the sayings led to the development of criteria for determining their authenticity, most notably multiple attestation, that is a saying attested in more than one source. Double dissimilarity, which is really tricky, is Jesus' position different from the Judaism of his day and different from the early church. So, for example, his position on divorce, no divorce, different than Judaism, different from the later church. Embarrassment, were the disciples embarrassed by it? A good example of that is the fact that they record Jesus' baptism by John. How do you explain that? I thought the greater was supposed to baptize the lesser. So how can the lesser baptize the greater? And coherence, that is, does it actually, if you take all the pieces, do they fit together? Just to mention the most famous. Scholars attempted to argue for the authenticity or inauthenticity of a saying or occasionally a deed based on these criteria. The third quest, 1985 to the present. This has continued to the present, but scholarship on Jesus took a turn in the mid-1980s when Robert Funk established the Jesus Seminar, a group of approximately 50 scholars and 100 laypersons who voted on the authenticity of the traditions. And I will just say as a footnote, I actually attended the first meeting of that. I was a doctoral student in Berkeley, and they met there, and I just sat in the audience and watched. The group was productive and issued 3 major reports, as well as issuing new translations of the early Gospels. The most notable member of the seminar was John Dominic Crossan, who wrote The Historical Jesus, the Life of a Mediterranean Peasant. Crossan dated a large number of the traditions that underlay the later non-canonical Gospels earlier than the canonical Gospels, and then applied the criterion of multiple attestation. And since there are more non-canonical Gospels than there are canonical Gospels, guess what happened? The non-canonical Jesus displaced the canonical Jesus in this reconstruction. While this is a simplistic assessment of a major scholarly work, it does capture the basic result. More importantly, Crossan and the seminar made the non-canonical Gospels relevant for the quest in a way that no earlier phase had. This is in part due to the fact that entire copies of the Gospel of Thomas were discovered at Nag Hammadi. The most significant of these was the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus that have been influenced by Gnostic thought. While the Gospel of Thomas is a 2nd century text, some of the traditions it incorporates may well be earlier than those in our canonical Gospels. At least, they cannot be dismissed out of hand. Crossan went on to raise the question of Jesus' cultural world by suggesting that Jesus is best compared to a cynic philosopher, calling Jesus a Jewish cynic or a cynic philosopher. While there is no evidence for cynics in Galilee during this period, and they did not gather disciples as Jesus did, the itinerant countercultural posture of Jesus led a number of scholars to draw parallels between the sayings of Jesus and sayings attributed to various cynic philosophers. By way of contrast, others more soberly emphasize, and I'm telling you what I think of that by my adverb soberly, emphasize Jesus' Jewish identity. Jesus' Jewish identity had been taken up by several Jewish scholars prior to this period, most notably Joseph Klausner and Geza Vermesch. It was, however, the work of E.P. Sanders that formed the real counterbalance to the views of the Jesus Seminar. Sanders broke with the scholarly tradition of concentrating on the sayings of Jesus and argued that we can best understand Jesus by beginning with 8 indisputable facts about his life. Jesus was baptized by John. He was an itinerant Galilean who preached and healed. He gathered a group of disciples. He confined his ministry to Israel. He engaged in a controversy about the temple, was crucified outside of Jerusalem by Romans. His disciples continued as a movement, and some Jews persecuted some early followers. Sanders made the controversy over the temple the fulcrum of his understanding and argued that Jesus must be understood against a Jewish background. This emphasis coincided with a newfound interest in material culture as a new source of evidence. The emphasis was on understanding the world of Galilee and of Judaism. You just heard a lecture on that. So, for example, archaeologists discovered the stone jar industry that helped us understand concerns of ritual purity. Now, this is a picture of a recent find up in Galilee of a stone jar factory. And you're maybe wondering, why stone jars? Because you can't pass impurity to stone, but you can pass impurity to pottery, in which case you have to throw it out. That's why we have all these broken pieces of pottery called ostraca that are found. But stone was impervious to the transmission of impurity. And so we know, this was a big business in Judea, and now we know it was also true in Galilee. Pre-70 synagogues were excavated in Gamla, which is the synagogue you're looking at here, the Herodium, Masada, Kiryat Sefer, Modi'in, and Magdala. So we have some ideas, and I do agree with Craig. I think that basalt foundation probably does reflect the first century synagogue in Capernaum, on which that beautiful limestone structure is built. The region of Galilee was studied to understand who the Galileans were, the population sizes of Galilee and its villages, and the agricultural and economic patterns. So, for example, how much wheat could be grown in the valley right outside of Nazareth towards Sippori, what we call Sippori in Israel today. And then what kind of economic exchange can you posit based on the size of those crops? While there is no direct archaeological evidence for Jesus, this work has expanded our understanding of his world immensely. The quest has not ended, nor does it show signs of collapsing. Perhaps, and this is my own personal view, the most impressive work in this phase is that of my former colleague, John Meyer. The strength of Meyer's work is that he works through the Gospels with painstaking methodological care. A reader understands why he judges a saying or an event authentic or not, because he works through that material systematically. The work is still a construction or reconstruction of the historical Jesus, but it is the most thorough and responsible treatment in this tradition that we have today. So that's my take on the quest for the historical Jesus. You can ask some of my colleagues, the New Testament people who have been presenting papers, to supplement that in conversations privately. Metropolitan Hilarion is in the process of releasing an English translation of his 6-volume account of Jesus Christ that stands over against this tradition. I think that it's important to recognize several aspects of the Metropolitan's context before turning to his basic methodology. At the conclusion of Volume 2, he sketches the position of Christianity in the former Soviet Union. When I read that, I realized he's writing in a very different social setting than in which I live and work. And while there have been shifts in the relationship between state and church in recent decades, and the church is flourishing, I tip my hat to all of you in Russia for promoting Christianity as you have, it's still a very delicate situation. One result of the Soviets' attempt to eliminate Christianity is that he cannot assume that his readership knows the biblical text or traditions. He needs to explain everything. And he's done so in a lucid and carefully crafted narrative that includes not only citations from ancient texts, but reproductions of art to assist his readers. And in this way, he's followed the model of medieval churches, where art was one of the primary ways to communicate biblical stories. He is thorough, 6 volumes. I can only say to him what I used to say to John Meyer when we were colleagues. You have to produce a 1-volume summary when all 6 are done. So there's another book for your press. But I hope you will write a 1-volume summary of these 6 volumes. I told him last night I couldn't help but think of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and the length of their novels in the 19th century and think he's following footsteps. Then he told me that he has a book on Dostoevsky, so maybe there was inspiration. Finally, he writes as a highly visible figure in the church, not for other scholars, as I typically do, but for those who doubt Jesus existed, those who accept his existence but do not believe, and those who are Christians but are skeptical about the historicity of the Gospels. And I think we all must take this seriously, this setting. He sets out, quote, to reproduce the living image of Jesus on the basis of the sources available and to present his teaching as it is reflected in the Gospels, end of quote. Like Kaler and Bultmann, he explicitly acknowledges that the evangelists are not historians, but witnesses. He recognizes that they are not disinterested observers, but participants, even if they were not present for every event they narrate. A major source for the evangelists was oral tradition, a tradition that was handed down verbatim in his judgment. And there's a slide. At first, Jesus' sayings and the stories of his life, which later formed the basis of the written text of the Gospels, were spread in oral form. But we can assume that at least in relationship to the sayings, these were in a verbally fixed form, which was reproduced more or less word for word when being transmitted. Here the Metropolitan follows the passive model of transmission made popular in scholarly circles by Birger Gerhardsen that is based on rabbinic practices. The Achilles heel of this model, in my judgment, is that it fails to explain the variations in the traditions attested by the Gospels. There are other models, but each has its own difficulties. Bultmann used what we call the progressive model, so that sayings developed over time. But this doesn't explain how you can go from a longer narrative to a shorter narrative, which happens frequently in the Gospel. Werner Kelber proposed a model of social identification and preventive censorships, end of quote, that posits a dialectic in which those who receive the tradition both identify with it and modify or discard it when they find it unacceptable. The result is a gap between the oral and the written tradition, a gap that many of us have found less than convincing. More recently, a number have used memory studies to explore the possibility that the Gospels reflect the basic outline of the first disciples' memories of Jesus. There is not, however, support for verbatim memorization and transmission. The most important methodological point the Metropolitan makes is that the Gospels must be interpreted from the perspective of the church. He writes, "Therefore, it is the church's interpretation of the gospel text that in many ways provides the key to its correct understanding, which to the highest degree corresponds to that which the author put in this text." End of quote. In this way, he stands squarely in the Orthodox tradition and counter to the Protestant tradition, that's my tradition, with its emphasis on sola scriptura, which he argues led to the development of biblical criticism and a break with the historical Christian tradition. This is a very different approach than the Nachleben or Wirkungsgeschichte method commonly used by scholars today. Let me explain. Nachleben just means that we oftentimes, and I can name commentaries like several in the Hermeneia series, the one on Matthew by Lutz, the one on Luke by Bovon are great examples of this, that trace how early Christians understood different sayings of Jesus and give you that history. But they're not using that history as a way of critiquing their interpretation. They're just showing you that tradition of interpretation so that you know what it is over against theirs. Wirkungsgeschichte takes this a little bit further by arguing that I am shaped by the tradition I have inherited. That is, I'm a Protestant, so I'm naturally shaped by a position of sola scriptura. It's a kind of a bias that exists in my mind, and I have to realize that when I read these texts. We are all shaped by the tradition, but we've inherited 20 centuries of interpretations of these texts, and we have to be honest about that. That's Wirkungsgeschichte. He appears to agree with the early Christian writers, this is the Metropolitan, who insisted that fidelity to the tradition of the church was the ultimate arbiter for reading Scripture. In my judgment, his approach makes two noteworthy contributions. First, his control of the early Christian material forms a rich depository of early Christian commentaries on the Gospels. Some of his treatments of the Gospels in light of early Christian writings are gems of exposition, and two of the ones that struck me most in the first three volumes were your treatment of the Pater Noster, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and your treatment of the feeding of the 5,000. These were just personal favorites of mine in reading through your books. Indices to these volumes will be a wonderful source for other scholars to consult the text that he has gathered. Most of us simply don't know the text the way the Orthodox do, or certainly the way that he does. Second, he demonstrates continuities between the Gospels and a number of early Christian writers, although not all. His reading of the New Testament is through the lens of the Orthodox tradition, And by Orthodox here, I don't mean Russian Orthodox, but I mean the general Orthodox tradition that comes through Christianity, and not through the lens of the entire Christian tradition. Irenaeus, not Valentinus. Athanasius, not Arius. Augustine, not Pelagius, are his companions. He does not discuss the challenge that variations within the early Christian tradition poses, but stands with the basic tradition of orthodoxy as it coalesced into a movement. Understanding this constriction, it is important to note that he has made a case for continuity between the Gospels and the early Orthodox tradition that is valuable. And I thank you. I mean that. I think that's a real contribution. There are, however, some difficulties. First, he tends to assume the historicity of the traditions in the Gospels. For example, in his comment on the story of Jesus walking on the water, he states, "We reject any interpretation of this event that assumes that it is not historically valid," end of quote. The challenge this stance poses is that it assumes the point to be proven. He's aware of that, I'm sure, but I have to say that. We could not make this argument with respect to the sources for Socrates or Alexander the Great. If we are speaking of history, I don't believe that we can make it with respect to Jesus of Nazareth. Second, he argues that the evangelists considered the events historical, and so must we. Now, I'm going to say something some of my New Testament colleagues might not even agree with, but here it is. I am not persuaded that all of the evangelists accepted all events as historical. It is well known that there are doublets in the Gospels. Luke has a pronounced tendency to avoid these, a tendency the Metropolitan attributes to Luke's non-Semitic perspective. But is this a convincing explanation? Greeks can repeat themselves too. For example, Luke does not have any of the material in Mark 6:45 through 8:26. And even though I operate with the two-source hypothesis, I'm not trying to assume that here. I'm just pointing out the differences. While I believe that there are different reasons for the, quote, great omission, one of them is that Luke has avoided a series of doublets. He has one boat scene in comparison to Mark's 2 in this section. He drops the story of the feeding of the 4,000, while Mark has both the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And he has the healing of one blind person rather than the two accounts in Mark. Luke appears to have been troubled by these doublets and dropped them. At least this is the best explanation for the fact that he has done this repeatedly. This means that there is a degree of historical skepticism on the part of the third evangelist towards some stories in the tradition. There is a similar move that Luke makes when he delays the initial calling of the disciples from Jesus' first encounter with them at the Sea of Galilee, as it's recorded in Mark and Matthew. When I was an undergraduate student and I read the Gospels seriously for the first time, I'd read them in church all my life and heard them, but really paid attention. I remember reading Mark 1 and just scratching my head and thinking, this doesn't make any sense. If somebody came along and asked me to sign over everything that I had and everything I'd ever inherit and go follow them, I'd never do that. And then I remember getting a synopsis and finding Luke and realizing that in Luke, this doesn't occur until chapter 5 after they witness Jesus perform a miracle. I thought, now that makes more sense. I get the psychological credibility of that. So we call this a Lucan transposition. But the point is that Luke, I think, was sensitive. Now you can make the point, I think Mark's not naive. I think Mark is making a theological point that when Jesus summons, you must answer. That's Mark's point, and I get that. But Luke is worried about psychological credibility, and so it's in a different place. That's the point I want to make. Finally, I find the rejection of the literary interrelationships among the synoptic gospels to be unhelpful. And this point has been made. I cannot work this way with the material in the Alexander tradition, and I do not think that I can do so with the Jesus tradition. We all understand the challenges and limits of the hypotheses that are offered for the text. However, a rejection requires significant argumentation rather than dismissal. Are we at an impasse? I don't think so. The Metropolitan has touched on the central theological issue in the quest. Are there continuities between the historical Jesus and the church? There have been those in the quest who have denied that there are. However, there have been many who have looked specifically for those continuities. Even Bultmann and those who followed in the second quest looked for continuities between the message of Jesus and the kerygma of early Christianity. The issues lie in where we look for the continuities and how. Let me suggest two major continuities. The first is the most obvious and the most important. As we noted, E.P. Sanders began his monograph with a series of 8 propositions that virtually all acknowledge. One of these was that Jesus collected a band of disciples around him, and that some of these disciples became a movement after Jesus' death. There is a connection between those who traveled with Jesus in Galilee and those who proclaimed him following his crucifixion. The common bond is their loyalty to the person of Jesus Christ. Bultmann's famous formulation, "the proclaimer became the proclaimed," recognizes both the continuity and the discontinuity between the lifetime of Jesus and the period after his death. The continuity is the person who led the disciples and then became the object of their faith whom they proclaimed. The discontinuity is in the role of the person. The transference from proclaimer to the content of the message required an elevation of the person. Early Christians would debate that elevation for at least 400 years. At this point, we don't have to attempt an explanation of all of that. I am simply affirming that there is a continuity that should be respected. The heart of the Christian tradition is the person of Jesus Christ, and the story of Christianity begins with the historical Jesus. That's the point I want to make. The second continuity is that the evangelists believed that there was a line of continuity between Jesus' proclamation of good news to the marginal and the entrance of the Gentiles in the early church. We've already noted that recent scholarship has worked to understand some of the purity and halakhic concerns of Second Temple Jews during Jesus' life. There is good historical evidence that Jesus clashed with some of the leaders in his society over these concerns. The controversies over the keeping of the Sabbath are perhaps the most famous, but they are not the sole area. It is worth remembering that Mark presented Jesus in controversy over the washing of hands before a meal that led the second evangelist to attribute a break with the Jewish law to Jesus. Now, I'm not ready to defend that Jesus broke with the Jewish law the way Mark presents, but the point I want to make is that Mark made the connection between Jesus' opposition to some of these concerns in his lifetime and the end of the law and the entrance of the Gentiles into the early church. The author of Acts made a similar connection in the story of Cornelius, where eating unclean food was associated with the entrance of the Gentiles. Luke omitted the story of the Syrophoenician woman in his gospel in order, in my judgment, to make the point here in Acts. Luke doesn't want Jesus preaching to the Gentiles in his gospel, that's held until Acts with the early church. In other words, Acts 10 is the Lucan equivalent to Mark 7. And you have to remember, Mark doesn't have a sequel. He doesn't have a volume about the early church. So he's going to do it. He's got to incorporate it in the lifetime of Jesus. Both authors point back to Jesus' challenges to purity concerns and the dismissal of them in the early church as a means of opening the movement up to Gentiles. They understood there to be a line of continuity between Jesus' debates over purity within Israel and the inclusion of Gentiles in the church. The importance that this has for our understanding of early Christianity is that it was the collapse of eating restrictions and purity concerns that opened the door to Gentiles and their presence among early followers of Jesus, which led to the development of a movement that no longer considered itself exclusively Jewish. On this reconstruction of early Christian history, Jesus is the founder of the church, even if it did not start until his disciples drew conclusions based on what they had learned while they were with him. The quest for the historical Jesus is an incredibly difficult challenge. I don't know if you've ever tried to do this, but I oftentimes would ask undergraduate students, would you like to know something about the historical? Oh, yes, yes, yes. And then you explain some of these challenges, and it's like they glaze over. No. No, I don't want to. I don't think I can do all that. Just as scholars have thrown their hands up in seeking to reconstruct Socrates, so we have found it virtually impossible to create as full an account of the historical Jesus as we would like. I do not, however, think that we cannot say anything about the historical Jesus. The Metropolitan is writing to promote faith, and in so doing, he begins with the Gospels and the church, and I think correctly so. He points out that the Gospels are not intended to be historical documents. They were written to promote faith in Jesus Christ. That's why we read them in church, and why we read them personally. And if that is the primary goal of a work, then beginning with them is the right place to start. While I'm a Protestant and do not give the early church the same theological importance that the Metropolitan or most of you do here today, I don't question the value of reading these texts to promote faith at all. On the other hand, if we want to ask about the historical Jesus, I do not think that we can look for Jesus after the Gospels in the early church, but must look for the historical Jesus before the Gospels. The same is true for any figure in the historical world. Socrates is not found after Plato, he is before Plato. That is, you have to work through Plato to Socrates. There is, however, common ground. This ground lies in the continuities between the Jesus before the Gospels and the Christ after the Gospels. This painting up here by Raphael is one of my favorites because on the bottom you see an episode of the disciples who could not cast out the demon in the boy, a very historical portrait, and then you see the transfigured Christ, who is the Lord of glory for us. And I think it's a nice combination of the historical and the elevated that forms the heart of our faith. There are continuities between the two, but they must be argued on historical grounds rather than theological presuppositions if we are to speak of the historical Jesus. Thank you. All right, so I've been handed the first question, which comes virtually. So what I'll do is read this question as it's been received and then try to respond. Greg, you mentioned that we have little evidence of Jesus' sayings in the Pauline epistles, and yet the undisputed Pauline epistles are our earliest extant Christian documents. In other words, Paul is a recipient of the earliest Jesus tradition. we learn several basic details about Jesus' life related to the Christ event, crucifixion and death. Some words of Jesus are likely preserved in Paul's Last Supper discourse in 1 Corinthians 11. There are other possible allusions to Jesus' teachings and words in Paul's letters, analogous to what we locate in the gospel tradition. One that comes to mind is that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night, 1 Thessalonians 5. My question to you and to the other panelists, are there benefits to historical Jesus studies in our close examination of Paul's epistles? Thank you very much for the question. It's a great question. So I would say unambiguously yes, if you're asking me. I do think that there's material that can be gleaned. My point is that in comparison to what we have in the Gospels, there's precious little in Paul. We do have some statements about Jesus' life from the standpoint of his death, his burial, his resurrection, the appearances. One thinks of 1 Corinthians 15. Some sayings that are reported by Paul are disputed as to whether they come from the historical Jesus or from the risen Christ through a prophetic source. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul makes a distinction between what he has received from the Lord versus what he says with reference to divorce. And he basically says, the Lord said, no divorce, and then issues what is famously called the Pauline privilege. There are many people who think that that must be a prophetic source rather than a historical Jesus. I'm still inclined to think, because it agrees with what we do know and can reconstruct from the Gospels that Jesus said, and it does meet the criteria of double dissimilarity, not in common with Judaism and not in common with the early church, that he's probably quoting the historical Jesus there. So I have colleagues who disagree with me about that, but that's my opinion. But when you add all these up, there isn't a lot. That's the point. You couldn't write a biography of Jesus. You could say he was descended from David somehow, Romans 1. You could say that he lived prior to Paul. You could say that he died, that he was executed, that he was raised, that there are appearance traditions. And you have a handful of sayings, and past that, you don't have a whole lot you can say. An expectation that he would come again. But that's pretty much it. So that's why I think some people would say, well, what do you make of that? Why isn't Paul interested in the historical Jesus? And I mean, this is again a matter of debate, like the story I told about the Zoroastrian joke with creation. You know, Bultmann used to quote 2 Corinthians and say, we did not know Jesus after the flesh. We don't want to know Jesus after the flesh. We don't care about Jesus after the flesh. And Bultmann said that's a historical Jesus. I don't agree with that interpretation of that statement in 2 Corinthians. But it is clear that Paul doesn't feel necessary. My assumption is that in the early church, there are stories being told about Jesus in the community, that there is an oral tradition, and that they have that. But Paul doesn't intend to write a life of Jesus. He's writing to address the needs of the community. So that's my response to it. And I'll let my panelists, who may have other opinions, respond.
Yeah, I agree with most of what you said. I don't know that Paul was not interested in the historical Jesus. Maybe just it's not the genre in which he's writing. And also, he wasn't there for most of the, he doesn't know as much until the Gospels have been written and so on, because he wasn't there. But also, just to tag on to what you said about prophecy, and agreeing with you on that, if you take 1 Corinthians 14, and Paul says, let 2 or 3 prophesy, then let the others evaluate. If that was a common custom, in every house church throughout the Roman Empire, throughout the first century. By the year 70, there may have been something like 700,000 every week. There may have been something like altogether 700,000 Christian prophecies. And it seems to me we'd be hard-pressed to see like one of those as being authoritative enough to be picked up by the tradition in the way that traditions about Jesus' sayings would be. So I'm more inclined to see Jesus' sayings feeding into the prophetic tradition, like what I think you have in Revelation 2 and 3, or like in Revelation 16 about coming like a thief in the night, rather than the reverse direction.
Yeah, I think those answers are good. I'm not sure I would have a lot to add other than, maybe I might pose the question differently. Why should Paul transmit Jesus' traditions? Both for the reason that Craig mentioned. He doesn't claim himself among the autoptai. He's not an eyewitness. It isn't, not only not the genre, but most of his letters address concrete problems in the congregation. And I suppose the place where he ought to appeal to a Jesus tradition is when a Jesus tradition could have been part of the resolution. And we have a handful of places where that's what he does, right? Like 1 Thessalonians, like 1 Corinthians 7, like 1 Corinthians 9, perhaps. So I think, it's one of those, it's sort of like, why don't we know more about Jesus from extra canonical sources? And the answer is, well, why should we? At least older ones, right?
I will add one other thing, which is not about Paul, but it's about the Johannine tradition. So the way many scholars today understand some of the discourses and sayings is they are based on older traditions and then are developed over time. And people have looked at some of the parallels to sayings in the synoptic tradition and then examine how those are reflected in the larger Johannine tradition and see that as a growth. So they do see the Johannine tradition as reflecting these earlier traditions. But Paul, that's different than what Paul does. I mean, that's a different model, but there's another model.
Hi. Thank you for your presentations. My question is for Dr. Sterling. In regards to a comment you said within your conclusion there, when you compared Socrates and Plato with Christ's life and how you wouldn't study their lives afterwards, but beforehand. Now, so in John 7 and in John 14, we read about, essentially the Holy Spirit coming after Christ has been glorified, and he being the one that will bring to remembrance and teaching all things. And so my question is, doesn't Pentecost distinguish Christ from the philosophers in that way?
All right, thank you. That's a great question. So I do think that there is a distinction between Socrates and Jesus. I mean, Socrates founded an enormous movement. It's not just the Platonic movement, but the Stoics and the Cynics are part of the Socratic tradition as well, and that should be recognized. But they don't have a spirit. I think when we think of the Spirit, that doesn't mean, I don't think the function of the Spirit is to preserve the historical record. I think the function of the Spirit is to lead us to faith and to lead us to understanding how our faith shapes our lives today. And in both the fourth gospel especially, and to some degree, I would say also in Paul and in Luke Acts, it's fairly explicit that the Spirit is a replacement for the presence of Jesus. That is, that's how Jesus continues to live with us. But that's a way of helping us in the present and the future more than it is simply remembering the past. In the Johannine discourse, like in 7 and 14 that you were referring to, I would understand that to mean that there are these traditions of sayings that Jesus said, but those are developed and fleshed out in discourses that speak to us today. It's the way to cross the ugly broad ditch, if I can use that metaphor. So that's how I see it, but both of you may see it differently. I don't know.
I'm in agreement, and this is your area.
Oh, no. Pneumatology. I think it's important to make a distinction between historical method and comprehensive knowledge. Like, simply because we say we can't establish something by historical method doesn't mean that historiography is epistemologically comprehensive. So it doesn't mean you can't believe something for other reasons. But when we talk about the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, we're going beyond historiographic method. So we can talk about it from the standpoint of faith, but yeah. I mean, I believe that the Holy Spirit could inspire people to remember things, and that the Holy Spirit then can expound it, both to bring to the remembrance and teach, like the Johannine tradition, I think, is more expansive in the speeches of Jesus and so on. But that's not to say the historiographic method as we usually define it doesn't have a place for that. So we'd have to work on meta-historical philosophy of history questions as to how to be able to address that.
Maybe we would just add that it seems that the judgment of the church has been that the canonical witnesses, which are the only ones that have any possible claim for eyewitness, belonging to an eyewitness generation, have a pride of place that has not been accorded to, say, mystical visions or otherwise derived sayings and teachings and encounters with Jesus. Right, so the church has not disallowed such, but it's said that the canonical witness holds an authoritative pride of place that, and presumably because of that eyewitness factor.
And I'm going to just put one other, this is a very difficult area, but I think it needs to be put on the table. The way historians work is by analogy. So what you have in the modern world, if you can see that, you can also believe there are analogies in the ancient world. If you have nothing equivalent, it's a hard sell. And you can argue against analogy as a category, and some people do, but that's a category. So if at my university, if I were to go to the history department and people in the history department and say the Gospels are authentic historical records because they were inspired by the Spirit, we wouldn't have a conversation. They would simply reject that out of hand because it wouldn't be part of how you go about historically. So for me, as a Christian, I consider this to be God's Word. And it's important and it's authoritative for my life. But that I'm making as a statement of faith. And then if I work as a historian, I have to use the same methods, that's the point Craig was making, that others use.
Yeah. I was converted from atheism, so I have I guess I have a special interest in trying to establish some things historically as a point of dialogue with people who may not accept my faith perspective, but they may accept historical method, and so there's a degree of overlap that we can start with as common ground, and I think historiography gets us that way. I do want to say one difference between Plato with Socrates, Plato and Xenophon, the period in which they wrote. When people talk about ancient biography, sometimes it's called proto-biography, because the genre of biography actually evolved over the centuries. So what we have, especially in the early Roman Empire, or even the late Republic, from, say, Cornelius Nepos to maybe as late as Diogenes Laertius, although it's starting to shift some already by his day. But he's very careful about documenting his sources and so on, is the historiographic apex of ancient biography. So it's considerably beyond what you have with Plato and Xenophon. So my default setting for biographies from the early Roman Empire would be to speak in terms of events that actually happened, whereas Plato's dialogues, I mean, the dialogue genre, at least the way it evolved, was not like Cicero is going to write something and he writes to a friend and says, by the way, I included you in this dialogue that I wrote. You know, in other words, he knows he's making it up. So, I mean, it's important to see where in historical development something is. And so I would see the Jesus material going back to eyewitnesses in a way that beyond what I would see with Plato and Socrates.
At risk of belaboring the question, one more comment, I hope, the last one. I think it's important to say something that I'm sure everyone will agree with up here, but hasn't been said, which is, I think we all would be in agreement. There's much more to be believed for a Christian than what historiographical canons could demonstrate. Right? So we're not trying to be minimalists or positivists in that sense. This is a touchstone for a faith under challenge, as is the case in our, skeptical post-Enlightenment world, and also positively a point of departure for persons without faith to say, well, wait a minute, not so fast. Here's some things that we can know on agreed-upon terms. So, but there's much more to be to believe than what we could demonstrate on historical grounds properly executed.
To follow up on all that, thank you very much for that skilled defense on the reason for historiography. I'm wondering, though, using that as a useful lens in which you can engage like a secular historian colleague, or using another lens like documentary hypothesis, rather than converting the secular, I've seen those lenses used to deconvert people of faith whose faith couldn't handle that contact. Thankfully, most of us here, I think, have gone through that great white ditch already. But I'm wondering, at what point is the cure worse than the disease?
So I'm going to respond in a very different way. I'm going to say this has helped my faith because it becomes real to me. And I understand that Jesus was a human being, and I think of Jesus as a human being. Now, as a Christian, I also believe he's more than that. But I can't, just from where I'm coming from, I can't pick up these texts and read them without asking some of these questions. And maybe some people can. I can't. That would be true for the way that I would read any text. So I have to ask these questions. It's how I'm programmed. It's part of my Western education. And finding answers that make sense are absolutely important. Now, there are people who clearly delight in trying to use historical criticism or in using historical criticism to debunk faith. And I have friends who do that. I'll not name them, but they actually delight in this. I don't. I think it actually works in reverse for me. But that's why I think it's important that in school that you have exposure to this so you know how to address it, and it can help you. And I do think it can help you and help you give a much richer explanation of text and answer questions that are very difficult questions that people in churches will ask.
I'm in strong personal accord with that. I feel much the same way as it regards my own faith, which isn't to say anybody else should feel that way, but I can't help it. It's what I'm hearing there, and it's true of me also. But just one word of pastoral advice for those that will be many of you pastors, priests in the church. I always tell my students, never take anything away from their people that they can't, when they aren't in a position, whether of their own expertise or time available or patience or whatever, when they can't replace it with something better. So there is an unwitting, it's actually unlike this, strong desire to subvert people's faith. There's an unwitting subversion of faith that sometimes takes place when the educated young theologian comes along and says, now, of course, we don't think Jesus actually, or of course, now here, Jesus, Matthew changed what Mark wrote, or something like that. That's scandalous to people if they're not in a position to sort of take it in a larger framework where it actually does make sense, where it is faith affirming, and so forth. So never take anything away unless you have the time and chance to give something better in its place.
Yeah, the framework in which it's presented really matters. I think Greg and I have some mutual friends who like to debunk faith, but I found from class evaluations that my students, one of the places that strengthens their faith most is when we deal with historical questions in the Gospels. Now, I do recognize the potential danger, and that my first book, not Christobiography, but the earlier one on the historical Jesus of the Gospels, I was just trying to deal with the things that I could establish based on certain criteria. And so I got into this minimalist frame of thinking that I would only speak about those things for which I could give sufficient evidence. And it got me in a little bit of trouble once I was in that frame of thinking, because sometimes my wife would say something to me to which I would respond, "Can you give me evidence supporting that assertion?" Now, there are a range of different views. I'm an egalitarian, but a range of different views on gender relations, but I can assure you that whatever your view on gender relations, that will get you in trouble. Especially my wife has a Ph.D. in history. So she reminded me that, a reliable witness is itself evidence. And I think that's important for our subject too.
It has been a long and very enriching day, and I somehow regret that I didn't hear all this stuff before I started the 6 volumes. I think the most important question which we discussed today was actually, where should we look for historical Jesus? This was a question which was explicitly mentioned in the last presentation by Professor Sterling. And his suggestion was that we should look for historical Jesus not after the Gospels, but before the Gospels. My suggestion in my 6-volume study is that actually we have to look for historical Jesus in the Gospels. Not after the Gospels, not before the Gospels, not around the Gospels, but in the Gospels. Now, in which Gospels? I would argue that in the canonical Gospels, not in the apocryphal Gospels, and not in the imagined Gospels, such as the before-mentioned Q source. Why should we rely on the 4 Gospels? Not because the other alternative Gospels are bad by themselves, but my argument is that the Church was very careful in selecting the material and in dividing it into what it believed to be authentic witnesses about Christ and various fantastic and non-authentic witnesses. And I think it was done with the specific purpose to have these 4 accounts for all of us as the main, the primary, and perhaps the only reliable source of the information about the historical Jesus. So I believe that it is the text of the 4 Gospels which should be the basis of the study of the historical Jesus. The text of the Gospels, not just various hypotheses or myths around the Gospels, but the text itself. This text is, of course, a complicated story by itself, because we have 4 Gospels and we have 3 which are clearly interconnected. And we can discuss for ages what sorts of connection exist between the 3 Gospels. And I think that from all existing hypotheses about the interrelations between these 3 synoptic Gospels, there is none which is fully satisfactory. There is none which can explain this interrelation in clear terms and give a definitive answer. Probably we will continue to be guessing how these 3 authors or multiple authors interacted, whether they relied on one source or on several sources, whether they relied on oral sources or on written sources. And this is what we can discuss, and this is what can enrich our understanding of the historical Jesus. When I started to write my study on Jesus, I didn't have any particular audience in my mind. Actually, my primary audience was myself. I was writing it for myself because I wanted to make clear for myself who the historical Jesus was and how we, the Orthodox people, should connect with the modern critical scholarship on the New Testament. I didn't have easy answers before I started reading. And I must say that after I finished it, I only had many more questions than before I started. My secondary audience, of course, was the Russian readership. And here you can clearly understand the difference between the context in this country, for example, and the context in which I live. Because in spite of the fact that for more than 30 years we now live in the situation of religious liberty, there is still a huge ignorance with regard to matters related to religion. I was recently visiting one of our major universities in Moscow. It is a technical university, but one of the leading ones. And the topic of my lecture was Dostoevsky and the Gospel. So I asked the audience, there were about 500 people in the audience, I asked them how many of them read Dostoevsky. And almost everyone raised their hands. But then I asked how many of them read the Gospel, and there were just a few hands. And this is in spite of the fact that in this audience, if you ask these people who they are, they would say we are Orthodox Christians. So they are Orthodox Christians, but they don't read the Gospel. They don't know what the Gospel says, and they don't even know why they should read the Gospel. So when I started to write this study, I realized that I have to really start from the scratch. I have to explain everything. I have to give not only the explanation of the text, not only the description of the text, not only the interpretation of the text, but I should start with the text itself. And this is why I include all the quotations from the Gospels into this study. Then, of course, a big question for me was how to organize the material. And I thought that there are some obvious segments which can be selected, such as, for example, the miracles of Jesus or the parables of Jesus. So I decided that I will proceed topically rather than proceeding, for example, from one gospel to another gospel, or proceeding chronologically, or proceeding in any other way. The work was meant to be catalytic for myself, for my readership, and I realized that my tertiary readership now is those who read this work in translation. There is now an Italian translation, I think, of the 5 volumes from the 6. There is now the English translation of the 4 volumes. And here, of course, this study will be catalytic, but in different sense, because here it will be read by people who are well versed not only in the gospel texts, but also in the modern New Testament scholarship. So it is here that I will be looking for critical assessment of my study. It was suggested that I should produce 1 volume out of 6. I must confess that I have already done this. But I will not let St. Vladimir Seminary publish it before the 6th volume is published. It so happened that I have a friend who is the governor of the Moscow district, not of the Moscow city, but of the Moscow district. And he visits me once a year. So he visited me shortly after the first volume appeared in Russian, and I gave it to him as a present. When he came next year, he said with some sort of disappointment, he said, "Well, I read your book on Jesus, but it's only about his birth." I said, "Yes, well, there will be some more volumes." And then I realized that this very pious person who is overloaded with his duties will not be able to read 6 volumes. So this is when I decided that I should produce one summary of the 6 volumes, and I did it for the series which is called The Lives of Notable People. There is such series. It was created by Maxim Gorky in 1933, and you can imagine who were the notable people included in this series. It was Lenin, it was Stalin, it was all possible revolutionaries and terrorists and bandits, alongside with great composers, writers, architects, etc. And so by now they produced more than 2,000 volumes, and everybody is included, all sorts of notable and notorious people, including the founders of major religions, including Buddha, Confucius, Mohammed, but there was no volume on Jesus. So when I met with the director of this series, he turned out to be a very pious Orthodox person. And I said, "Why didn't you have a volume on Jesus?" He says, "Well, how is it possible? He is God." So in the Soviet times, they didn't include him because they believed that he didn't exist. And now they didn't include him because they believed that he was God. So my response was that, well, the fact that he was God did not prevent him from being a notable person. And the next question was, well, how is it possible that a biography of Jesus will be standing on the same shelf with biographies of revolutionaries, of terrorists? Well, I said his cross was standing among the two crosses of two thieves. So I don't think he will mind that his biography will be standing with biographies of not only notable but also notorious people. This was my response. Perhaps I should finish by referring to this poster, which says the event will resume shortly. I enjoyed this event very much, and I would like to express my hope that maybe in 3 or 4 years, which is very shortly by standards of one human life, we will resume here and we will continue our discussions. Maybe by that time, volumes 5 and 6 will come out. Some new challenges will be in these volumes. Maybe they will be catalytic of some more discussions. And I very much hope that we will continue these discussions because I believe that they are mutually enriching for us, the Orthodox scholars, and for those New Testament scholars who dedicated their whole life to the study of Jesus. And I would like to express my admiration and gratitude to those scholars who made their way to St. Vladimir Seminary for these discussions, and also to St. Vladimir Seminary for providing for us this unique opportunity to meet and to discuss what is the most important book for every one of us, the New Testament, the Gospels, and of course to discuss the person who is at the core of our life, Jesus Christ, God incarnate. Many thanks, and God bless you.
Please be seated for a moment. Just a few words, some more protocols, and most importantly, some thanks. This has been a remarkable 2 days here. We will continue it tomorrow morning around the altar. Vladimir Hilarion will be presiding at Hierarchical Divine Liturgy in our chapel beginning at 9 a.m. Tomorrow, the Feast of St. John Chrysostom, the con-celebrating clergy, I remind you, should be there at 8:30 and say your prayers and get vested. I'm always hesitant when I thank people for putting on an event like this because I know I'm forgetting somebody, but there are so many. The moving parts for this conference were, well, you can imagine, just quite amazing. We all ate well, so we should thank Chef Nat and his team, that's for sure. Yeah. Well, besides eating, several other things just went really well, and I'm going to go down the list. Technology, I know how many hours were spent with Georgios and Alexandru on this technology. This was the first time we've used this new equipment. I saw the lights burning late in here. They put a lot of hours, a lot of effort in, and you worked flawlessly for us. And again, we thank you for everything you've done there. We've had excellent communication from Deacon Alexander. All the marketing with Sarah. They're over here. Stand up and we'll acknowledge you. Yeah, stand up. The people who helped bring in the dollars to make this conference work, Karen and Macrina and Jenny and Ted and Anthony in the bookstore. Anthony's back there. Hi, Anthony. There you go. We've got it there. Melanie in finance, keeping track of all of these things. Father Nicholas, and particularly seminarians. I noticed at one point we needed 44 volunteers from the seminarians to make all of this work, with a great deal of fraternal pride in the seminarians here. my personal thanks and those for everybody else. You guys really do it well. I like to remind people that St. Vladimir's would look very strange without you. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Alex and my faculty colleagues. I like to tell people that I live in an environment with a faculty that are all 110%ers. Everybody reaches high, the bar is high, and everybody reaches to get there. And you're simply an inspiration. In all of your various disciplines, you challenge all of us to rise to the very best possible. And I thank you for that, your collegiality and your well, just your friendship. That's something that's very, very special indeed. There's another group of seminarians I want to thank. There was a lot of activity here in the hall last night. I watched it. They transformed this room into the auditorium again. But I then went over to the chapel, and it is spick and span and clean from top to bottom over there. So I thank Father Tom Miller, who cracked the whip, and Deacon Vitali. It's absolutely magnificent over there. I've never seen it look so well. So thank you for your late hours last night in doing that. We've had terrific sponsors, and again, they should be acknowledged for those who are listening. Archbishop Melchizedek, the Orthodox Christian Vision Foundation, Dr. Charles and Mary Lee Agelat, their son Richard, President of the Alumni Association, Dr. Don and Sue Tamalonis, and the Grace and Mercy Foundation. Again, if you're interested in helping SVS Press to bring the printed text that we've heard portions of today, I know there are fuller texts from all of the presenters, contact the seminary and we'll work with you, and you'll actually get a little credit in the book when it's published, if that's a little more incentive. But last but not least, of course, I want to thank His Eminence, Metropolitan Hilarion, for his friendship, his support of this institution. As I noted last night, he holds the trophy in terms of the very many ways in which he has supported this particular institution. And because of your work, which we've been honoring today, we had really 6. We had 9 outstanding presenters here. And I had a little note from Father George Parsenios, who would have been amongst the 9, and he's doing a little better, but he really does have a challenge, so he's asked for our prayers. So Your Eminence and the 9 presenters, really, all of us are so inspired and have much to think about.